Rick Hahn finally speaks years after being fired, and let's go over just exactly what Luis Robert Jr.'s trade value is from two teams that have been linked to trying to trade for him on today's episode of Locked On White Sox.
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm your host, Todd Welter, a lifelong Sox fan. I write for SouthsideShowdown.com, part of the FanSided Network, and also I've covered Major League Baseball for outlets such as the Associated Press. And thanks for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure to hit the like button. Make sure to hit the like button on today's episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox if you've not done so already, and also follow or subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We've not heard much from former White Sox general manager Rick Hahn since being fired in the summer of 2023. He made an appearance on MLB Network, and I want to discuss his comments on how bad things got with the Sox that led to the team's current state. And then I spoke with Locked On Mets host Ryan Finkelstein to get New York's perspective on Bob Nightengale's latest rumor regarding Luis Robert Jr. possibly being traded to the Big Apple. And finally, I spoke with Jeff Carr of Locked On Reds to get his take on maybe Cincinnati might be interested in trading for LRJ. All right, so you've not heard much from Rick Hahn since he was fired in August of 2023. But he finally spoke on MLB Network in a 5-minute interview, and he gave his side of things of why the team had to go through that rebuild last decade and why things unraveled so quickly. So I do find Rick in some cases to be a victim here, but I also find him to be the accomplice to the crime as well. You know, I almost call him a willing hostage. You know, he's a victim in that the owner torpedoed his rebuild, and it was Rick Hahn's rebuild. Because you've got to give him credit for basically convincing Kenny and Jerry, look, we can't just keep patchworking this roster together. It's not working. We're not having sustained success. You know, they're winning, maybe they're doing well in April and May, like he pointed out in 2016, but then it just completely falls apart. You know, it's just, you can't keep trading away prospect capital for aging veterans that are probably well past their prime. This just cannot work anymore. You know, mired in mediocrity, as he said. So I give him credit for saying, hey, let's, especially when it was in vogue, let's do what the Orioles are doing. Let's do what the Cubs are doing. Let's just bottom out, collect a bunch of top draft picks, you know, collect a bunch of exciting young players by trading off the assets we have. And let's go into the next decade with the chance to win multiple championships. So he gets credit for that, you know, especially since he was never fully empowered, though, because it was his rebuild, but he was never fully empowered because, again, you never knew who was really running the White Sox. Was it Jerry Reinsdorf? Was it Kenny Williams, who was technically Rick's boss? And that's the other thing. Like, you basically, Kenny kicks himself upstairs, but then you say, okay, Rick, you're the face of the front office. A lot of these decisions are going to be yours, but you still have a boss. And Rick kind of treated it like, he's my boss. And it's kind of hard for it to be your show when your boss is the man who built the 2005 World Series team. And that kind of gives you a right to have an ego. I mean, if there's two executives in the history of baseball that have the right to have a little bit of swagger, it's Kenny Williams and Theo Epstein. Because Theo Epstein built the roster that broke the curse of the Bambino and the Billy Goat. And Kenny Williams built the roster that broke the curse of the Black Sox. I mean, those were historic championship droughts. You know, mythic almost. So, yeah, it's kind of hard when you have that type of boss who's like, well, I built a World Series team. And I just saw this guy at a showcase. He's our draft pick. You know, that type of stuff. And he said in the interview, collaborative a lot. And as you could tell, that led to some bad decisions. Because, you know, Kenny could probably think one thing. Jerry could think one thing. And we know what the Tony La Russa thing. And that's the other thing. Collaborative, that could lead to a lot of dysfunction. You know, so I think that's where he's a victim. He's a victim, too, in that he mentioned being boxed in by payroll. And that's not how you complete a rebuild. You spend money to put yourself over the top. And Jerry just never authorized that. He was always boxed in with limited financial resources. But where I put the blame on Rick, and this is where I say he's the accomplice, is first of all, prioritizing cost control when maybe he didn't understand what motivated players. You know, I think it was a good idea to get some of those guys locked up since the owner doesn't spend much money. So I get why Rick was like, you know what? I'll give Eloy $43 million so I can get a couple of club options so I could get some more club control, like he's doing with, like right now with Luis Robert Jr. So I kind of get the logic. But he should have estimated, okay, what are these guys motivated by them? Are they motivated to be great and they're going to still show up and work hard? Or are they motivated by the money? And if they're motivated by the money, then yeah, you got to play the ARB game. You just got to accept it. Because in hindsight now, it has shown Yoan Moncada just did have to leave. You did have to pay him to go away. Eloy Jimenez had to be traded for pennies on the dollar. Because again, it seems like those guys were probably motivated by the money. And once they got their money, they didn't need to really work that hard, as speculated. And I also think Rick deserves blame for not properly allocating the money he was allowed to spend. He nickeled and dimed at second base and right field, two positions that can impact a game a heck of a lot more than a reliever can. And finally, he deserves blame for not quitting after La Russa was hired as the manager. That's where I always think he was a willing hostage. I think he did need to send the message that I don't care if there's only 30 of these jobs. I put this team together. And if you want an out-of-date guy running the clubhouse over just some regret, I'm out of here. Because that's not going to work. Tony La Russa, I mean, again, to the Tony apologists, yes, he's a Hall of Fame manager. But when he came back 10 years later, the game had dramatically changed. He even admitted he didn't even know the rules. He was not the guy to run that clubhouse. AJ Hinch clearly was the right guy for the team. And that was the guy that Rick wanted to hire. You needed a guy with energy. You needed a guy with an analytical mind. You needed a guy that was going to allow that clubhouse to have some swagger. You needed a guy that just understood this is what modern baseball is now. It's more about hitting home runs and not put the ball on the ground and try hard. TW. David Eckstein, that type of stuff. So that's where I always think he's a willing hostage, for example. And that's where he allowed himself to be held hostage. So that's where I don't give Rick that much grace. I mean, obviously I give him grace for the stuff I said above of why he's a victim, but not when it comes to that stuff. And the arrogance of ask me after the parade when he should have totally realized the ground was cracking around him. That when Houston just absolutely boat raced the White Sox in the 2021 Division Series, he should have realized, oh my gosh, we got to make some more dramatic changes. Jerry, you got to give me more money. I don't care. This is not going to sustain. But he said, ask me after the parade. So here's the summary of the things he said. At least he did have some humor about the Pope being a Sox fan. How he said, he's like, I'm sure the Pope has some opinions, just like the rest of us in terms of the rebuild. He was asked about how did he navigate the power dynamic of Jerry Reinsdorf, Tony La Russa, and Kenny Williams. He did acknowledge that Kenny and him are actually still close, but he did say it was very collaborative on major decisions. And I don't think you really can have that type of collaboration, especially when you got an owner that cites David Eckstein as his favorite player. And he did say La Russa was a consensus hire, but seeing his language and what he said, like mentioning debate, obviously that wasn't his call. He said, like, for example, they tried too long feeding the beast after winning the 2005 World Series, and that's why they needed to get to the rebuild. They could no longer feed basically what I would think even a dying beast. And he explained, how did everything unravel? Well, he said bad luck and injuries. He cited in 2021, they could plug holes with the players that they drafted, but you could tell they were, I think what he was alluding to was the draft started to get worse and worse where they couldn't plug the holes then with the injuries in 2022. They overestimated players' growth. And they made some bets on players to grow into what they projected to be. And he said they got boxed in from a payroll standpoint and that the culture wandered a little bit and the vibe changed and they lost that competitiveness. About the only thing that I would love for Kenny Powers to have asked, and obviously I'm not expecting him to do White Sox business, is I would have actually loved for him to ask, what did it feel like to get replaced by Chris Getz? Because he was a part of this unraveling. Did he feel betrayed or backstabbed? Well, anyways, Luis Robert Jr. was one of the exciting players Rick Hahn acquired, and he's likely now going to be out the door soon too. So let's discuss just exactly what his trade value is to the Mets with a crossover segment with Locked On Mets host Ryan Finkelstein, and that's after the break. Get the supplies you need from the site for the skilled trade Supply House. Whether you're in plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is a reliable way to order products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory of over 200,000 plus parts from 400 plus top brands, you'll find exactly what you need delivered fast from coast to coast. Need help with an order? Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for the trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free Trade Master program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage. Now it's your turn. Join the Trade Master program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Again, that's supplyhouse.com/TM. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. Again, that's SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, make sure to hit the like button on today's episode and subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox if you've not done so already. And if you can't catch the show on YouTube, Locked On White Sox is available on all major podcast platforms. So make sure to follow or subscribe on places such as Apple or Spotify. Either way, get your 30-minute fix of Chicago White Sox baseball venting with me. So I kind of wanted to gauge the interest of, are the Mets actually interested in trading for Luis Robert Jr.? Do they even need Luis Robert Jr.? Is Blade Tidwell an actual overpay, an underpay, or just about right? So I talked with Ryan Finkelstein, host of Locked On Mets. All right, Ryan, do you actually think Blade Tidwell will be an overpay, an underpay, or just right? As some Sox fans seem to think Luis Robert Jr. would be worth more in a trade.
Well, I think it's interesting just to talk about where Luis Robert is at as a trade asset, because that contract will look great at one point in time. Now I'm looking at it, and you have a couple club options left at $20 million per, and I don't know if Luis Robert is a great value on that deal at the way he's played. So with that said, I think it's pretty fair if that ends up actually being what the trade package is, in the sense that if you're the Mets, yes, Blade Tidwell is a good pitching prospect in AAA. He's got really good stuff, but he's not Brandon Sproat or Nolan McLean, two other pitching prospects that have a AAA that are definitely in higher regard in the system. So I think the Mets could get an impact player at the deadline for Blade Tidwell. They'd be pretty thrilled, but I also don't know what teams are going to be lining up to get Robert for a better package.
And I'm glad that you pointed that out, because while I still think Luis Robert Jr. might have a little bit more value, I always think his value is somewhere between, what we saw in 2023, but then what reality is, and that is he's a guy who strikes out 30% of the time. He's a guy that's usually always injured, but at the same time, so that's why I think he's somewhere in between. But at the same time, again, he can beat you with his bat, his glove, and on the base path. So I think that's where you got to try to figure out the sweet spot of what to get to, what would you trade for him in relative to his contract? Because especially, if he does get hurt, then the White Sox have to pay him $2 million just to go away. So I think that's why they're in such a rush. Do do the Mets actually need the outfield help?
So it's interesting. I think the Mets are definitely in wait and see mode, because they've gotten really good production lately out of Tyrone Taylor. They have a roster right now that is pretty loaded. Jesse Winker just went on the IL, and that allowed Brett Beatty to come back, and Beatty has played really well. So now the Mets are juggling Beatty, Jeff McNeil, Luis and Acuna between third base, second base, and then getting Jeff McNeil in center field a little bit. So it's an interesting time for the Mets, where they have guys, they have more guys than spots right now anyway, but they don't really have a center fielder at this time that I could say for sure is going to bring them value both defensively and offensively come playoff time. So I think Robert is kind of a luxury add potentially for the Mets. I don't know if they'll make it though. Everyone thinks, the Mets are just going to keep spending, and Steve Cohen certainly will do that, but they're at a point now where picking up Robert, even for just this year, will be pretty expensive. So I think they'd have to really feel that they were a bat away. Viewing center field as a place to add that bat, Robert would still probably be the best guy on the market, you would figure. So it's one of those things where I think the Mets would definitely be a kind of late deadline decision. Right now, I can't say for sure they're going to need that bat, but it is an exciting possibility. I think the hope that the Mets would have in making a trade like this is that you would get Robert in a new situation away from what's been going on in Chicago with the White Sox the last couple of years, and maybe you get that top end version, which could be a complete game changer still, of course.
Yeah, I mean, that's where again, where I was like, Blade Tidwell, I mean, hopefully he's just part of the package. If he's the headliner, I would be a little bit disappointed, but I can see again why, where again, if he goes to another team like the Mets, where he's not the guy, he can just be part of the guys. I think you'd be getting some good value there. But you just saying that right there, they just don't sound like a team that's just going to jump the market, especially when Tyrone Taylor, he can get you through a season. Now, obviously, do you want to have maybe something better in the playoffs? Sure, but he's sufficient enough to get you through a season.
He is. He's a really good defender, and he has been hitting really well for about a month ever since Jose Siri went down. Tyrone Taylor's kind of run away with that job, and so the Mets are going to have to see where they're at. Come that point in time, they will have Jose Siri back as well by the deadline. So how does he factor in? You have some prospects on the way in center field that the Mets like. Jet Williams is their top position player prospect who could flex out and play some center field. He's athletic enough to do it. So the Mets got to see what they want to do. I don't know if they're the team that is going to go all in for Robert, but again, he might be that piece where if you're sitting there and you're in first place and you want to make a move for a guy that can put you over the top, the Mets might do that. And I would also say, I think I can't see it being under any circumstance really a Blade Tidwell 1-for-1 for Robert. I think it'd more be like you kind of mentioned there that Tidwell would be the headliner and the Mets could probably fill out a package. They have a farm system that is really loaded this year. A lot of guys are making real strides. So I'm sure the Mets could throw in another piece in a trade to make it a little more attractive. But I'd be curious if there's another team that at some point kind of shows themselves for the deadline that really needs the bat in a big way. And center field is the place where they want to put it, where there might be a team that could be a little more desperate than the Mets at the deadline. I don't know if they're going to be desperate to make this move. Again, I would view it more as like a luxury ad for the Mets.
Yeah, like when I saw Blade Tidwell in the Bob Nightengale report being kind of like, hey, here's the guy that they're going to jump the market for, I was like, then the White Sox might want to wait, out, maybe another 2 months, wait till the trade deadline and maybe see if you can get a better offer. One guy though that did intrigue me, again, everybody's list is different. I know you write for Just Baseball and you guys have a different list and all that stuff. But Connor Hawk, right? Or Houck, the former first round pick in 2023, he's at MLB Pipeline's, their 30th ranked prospect. He seems to be falling down. Would he be somebody that the White Sox might want to take a gamble on? The only reason why I just draw the conclusion is the White Sox already just acquired the Red Sox. Now, granted, they had interest in Braden Montgomery originally, but they did get a former first-round pick in that deal for Crochet. So maybe they might be thinking, okay, Tidwell and maybe Houck, right? I mean,
Houck has started swinging a little bit better, so there might be a little more upside for the White Sox to buy into. Last year, he had a really rough first season, but I mean, he was drafted out of high school, and Houck was a two-way player in high school. He was a quarterback that I believe had some real D1 offers too. So really good athlete. I could see that. Another guy that I could see potentially getting moved who doesn't really have a place on the Mets roster that is kind of a high upside flyer, but a guy that's been hurt is Ronnie Mauricio. He had a torn ACL or some ligament in his knee, and he was out all of last year. He's still slowly making his way back, but there is a lot of upside with Ronnie Mauricio, and because of the talent the Mets have in their infield already with Vientos and Beatty and Acuna and Jet Williams coming, or they might not have a place for Mauricio that might make Mauricio more expendable. So we'll see where the value is at for Robert at the deadline. If he plays really well leading up, all of a sudden now you can maybe say, all right, maybe you get Tidwell as the headliner, but there's a couple of different upsides, like a longer term upside play and a guy like Houck, and maybe a shorter term upside play and a guy like Mauricio. The Mets have a lot of different ways that can go about putting a package together. I think those are a couple of guys that are probably a little bit more expendable in their system.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Mauricio because I was actually going to ask you about him because he's a guy that I've always eyed. Like I know when there's Garrett Crochet being, tied to him, and I saw he was tumbling down the rankings, and I know he was injured, and I think he's hitting 125 right now. But if he's still coming back from an injury, that makes sense that he's probably going to be slowly working his way back. What about Drew Gilbert? That was another one where I'm like, well, okay, maybe because the White Sox need bats. That's the biggest thing they need more. Now, granted, they could always use pitching with the injuries that they had to their young hurlers with Tommy John surgery, but they definitely need more bats. And Drew Gilbert, I was like, well, maybe that's a guy that they could press their luck on. And maybe if they wanted to get a higher tier again, we don't know what their board is. But then I see him like he was the number 2 prospect according to MLB Pipeline in 2024, and now he's already down to like what, 9 or 10?
Yeah. So you have some of these guys who they get hurt and it really affects their rating. That's the case with Drew Gilbert. Had a bad hamstring injury last year that kept him out for pretty much all of the year. Even had him slower start this year. Drew Gilbert is definitely a really interesting prospect. I think he's another guy that would probably be somewhat expendable to the Mets because they have, like I mentioned, Jet Williams. They have Nick Morabito as another center field prospect that's in Double-A. So, and they also have Carson Bench, their first-round pick from last year, who I think would be untouchable, who also could play center field. They have a lot of different guys. So I could see Drew Gilbert being another expendable one. And he's also a guy, though, that the Mets might just decide, hey, let's stay internal, and they might give Drew Gilbert a shot this year in center field instead of making a trade. So Gilbert's definitely another intriguing option. He's one of those guys where he doesn't have the everything kind of has to go right for his game to work out, but like a 50 grade guy all around with all the tools, but you put it all together, it could be a really nice player. Or if not, he's definitely a real strong candidate to be a solid 4th outfielder in the big leagues.
You know, it was a better farm system to trade with? The Cincinnati Reds. And I spoke with co-host of Locked On Reds, Jeff Carr, to gauge if there's hope of the Reds re-engaging the Sox in trade talks for Luis Robert Jr., and that is next on Locked On White Sox. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, shout out to all the everydayers. I appreciate your loyalty. Please hit the like button on today's episode and recommend to your fellow Sox fans or baseball fans, friends, to subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox, where they get their podcasts, as this show is available on all major podcast platforms. So it's great to see that the White Sox took the series from the Cincinnati Reds. As I'm recording this, hopefully they actually get the sweep. You know, I was really impressed that Mike Vassell, they tried him out as a closer and got the 3 outs. So why not try him again? Can't hurt. That's the whole point of this exercise of the season. But the one thing that you definitely want to see maybe possibly happen is the Reds re-engage the White Sox in trade talks to get Luis Robert Jr. because they have the better farm system. And I talked with Locked On Reds co-host Jeff Carr about that. All right, Jeff. So with the reported decline of what the White Sox will take back, would this possibly renew the Reds' interest in Luis Robert Jr.?
Absolutely. I think that reportedly the rumors that we had heard and the different trade packages that we heard in the offseason were very concerning because it was like all of the top prospects, right? Like Chase Petty, Rhett Lauder, and Edwin Arroyo. And then they started talking like things like that. And quite frankly, I think if it were one of those guys and then maybe like a mid-level prospect or maybe 2 of those guys and that was it, I would definitely be into it. And I know that the White Sox were among the teams that during the offseason, whenever they were discussing trades, they were also discussing major league players because that was something that Nick Krall said was a big hang up for him. So whenever they talked to teams, they weren't just looking for prospects. They were looking for major league talent at the same time. I think if you're talking about a trade package now that is built around prospects, and if it's a major league guy, it's a guy that can kind of be a bridge to another player, I think that's a much more palatable situation for the Reds.
Yeah, I think Chris Getz completely overplayed his hand in the offseason when, I mean, I had no problem with going for Cam Collier or Sal Stewart. It was when he went a bridge too far and tried to throw in Rhett Lauder. But, you know, if Luis Robert Jr. starts to continue to produce at the plate, because it sounds like, you know, they're willing to maybe take pennies on the dollar because the White Sox are so afraid that he's going to get hurt. And he's got knee soreness. He should be back in the lineup, but obviously he's got knee soreness. If he starts to produce at the plate, would there be a consideration to maybe up the offer to beat the Mets? Maybe, you know, include some of those guys in the top 10, maybe, because I know the Reds, 5-6 guys now in the new recently MLB Pipeline Top 100.
I think that there would definitely be a renewed interest. It's tough because I've had some folks ask me, they're like, well, Blake Tidwell, that's the Mets number 15 guy, our number 15 guy. And I'm like, whoa. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking like teams don't have the MLB pipeline list and they're going, okay, they're number 15 guy or they're number 15 guy. They've got scouting reports that are far beyond what we see from the different websites that we are privy to. So I think that really when you look at it, Blake Tidwell is a 23-year-old right-handed pitcher who's at the AAA level. He's close to being ready. I think the Reds can definitely counter that with Chase Petty. And then I almost would be willing, and I kind of think this gets this done. I don't necessarily know what the Mets would be offering, but I think that if it were an offer of Chase Petty and Edwin Arroyo, I would do that deal, because Edwin Arroyo is a very good shortstop, but he's blocked. And I don't know that the Reds are ready to move Ellie De La Cruz just because Edwin Arroyo is ready next year. And I don't necessarily know, because they have not played Edwin Arroyo at other positions that much in the minor leagues, that they're going to move Edwin Arroyo for that. So I think that the Reds are just kind of looking for the right deal to include Edwin Arroyo in. I think this would be that deal. The Reds just traded for Connor Joe the other day because they're looking for whatever they can get in the outfield. Luis Roberts, way better than Connor Joe. I know that. And I know that he's probably better than what the Reds currently have at any of the outfield positions, assuming that he stays healthy, which has always been the biggest question with him. But I still think that that would be the kind of swing. Like, if I saw the Reds make that trade, I'd be super excited.
Well, actually, on the White Sox side, I'd be super excited too, because Chase Petty is a guy that could actually pitch in the majors right now, and they do need a starter because, Bryce Wilson, he's been a decent opener, but he can only get through 4 or 5 innings. So if you're willing to offer that, hey, sign me up. And is Edwin Arroyo, right? He's the one that's out for the year, though, right? Or is it?
No, he's back. He's back. He was out last year. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah. But even then, I would take that in a heartbeat, of course. I mean, because you're talking about, the top 15 prospect in the Mets. And I know it's not 1 for 1, but the one thing I did want to ask you, though, there is a way, though, that the Mets, say it was 1 for 1. The Mets have Connor Phillips. Obviously, his numbers are very high at AAA in terms of his ERA, but he has made it to the majors already. So let's say that's where Nick Kroll starts at. He said, hey, you're going to take the 15th prospect. Obviously, they all have their different rankings. What would the White Sox even be getting then?
Connor Phillips would be interesting because he has gone through, trying to think of a synonym to rough patch, but it's been a heck of a rough patch. I mean, he was up in the majors for a little bit there at the end of the 2023 season, and he pitched in that final game that really sort of knocked the Reds out of the playoffs, and he didn't get out of the first inning. It was a really rough outing for him, and ever since then, it seems as though he's lost the strike zone, and now they are pitching him as a relief pitcher. They are looking to see, there are some reports, and they're unsubstantiated, but I've heard some rumors that he goes through a thing. Like, once he gets to about 30 pitches, his arm changes, and he just doesn't quite have the longevity to be a starting pitcher. So right now, I think, and this was even guessed at whenever he was acquired from the Mariners, is that eventually he would move to the bullpen. I think we're seeing that now. I think we're seeing what the Reds can get out of him in the bullpen. So that being a 1 for 1 comparison to Blake Tidwell, you're definitely taking Tidwell over Phillips right now. As much as I would love to see the Reds just trade Connor Phillips and get Luis Robert, that would definitely be a big fleece, because right now Connor Phillips does not look like a starting pitcher.
Yeah, and the only reason why I bring him up is I'm actually very impressed by your generous offer of Chase Petty and Edwin Arroyo. It's just, the reason why is just anything I've ever read is and even just hearing GM Chris Getz on the Sox side is saying is he's basically thinking Luis Robert Jr. is still at the 2023 value, where I think he's somewhere in between. He's somewhere, obviously, I don't think he's 2024 level where he's always injury prone. I think that's something to point out, but he is a guy that has shown in 2025 that yes, he's still struggling at the plate, but he can still beat you sometimes by himself with his bat, with his glove, and on the base pass all in one game. Just ask the Milwaukee Brewers. That happened last week. So that's the reason why I'm just asking is I could see teams though still countering and be like, I'm only going to give you a top 15 prospect. So one top 15 prospect when I was looking over the list, and again, like you said, everybody's got different lists though. Hector Rodriguez, number 11. Say that gets the deal done. Is that a bridge too far? And the reason why I want to bring that up is he's crossed the AA threshold. And usually for small market teams, once you get to AA, and if you prove you can hit, you're probably in the core.
Yeah. And he, without a doubt, looks like the best outfield prospect that the Reds have in the system, because the issue that they will be addressing this or this trade deadline, they should be addressing, because they've not addressed it for multiple years now, is the outfield. And it's not just a now issue, it's a future issue as well, because even as good as TJ Friedl has been when he is healthy, he's 29. It's not as if he just began a long career. And you might still have him for 3 or 4 years. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but coming behind him is Not a lot. I mean, Hector Rodriguez is the best that they've got coming up. They've tried Blake Dunn. They've tried Jacob Hurtubise. They're trying Reese Hines. They're trying Will Benson. Both of those guys have a lot of question marks surrounding them that they are going to have to answer before you can consider them part of the future of this team. And while Hector Rodriguez has not made a major league debut, just like you said, he's gotten to Double-A, and we're starting to get to the point where it's like, okay, we're really beginning to count on him as part of the future of the team. I don't necessarily know that that makes him untradeable. The Reds' outfield future is so very up in the air right now. And that's another reason why they need a guy like Luis Robert that has multiple years of team control, because you can keep him in the outfield for multiple years and expect him to grow maybe a little bit more into his game. While you look at other options, like they signed Austin Hayes to a 1-year prove-it deal. As much as he has looked nice in 16 games, it's hard to say, yeah, let's give him a long-term contract and the outfield is set with him. So you need to make that kind of a big move. I think that Hector Rodriguez would be interesting to me. I would be a little bit more hesitant for him than Arroyo, simply because Arroyo's blocked and Rodriguez is not. And I think that Chase Petty is coming from an angle, and there's going to be some folks, because every team has this, right? White Sox fans, there are certain White Sox fans that are like, we call them prospect huggers, right? They really like to hold up. Yeah, Reds, there's some Reds fans like that too. And there's going to be that group of people that's mad at me for even considering allowing Chase Petty and Edwin Arroyo to be available in this trade, but the Reds fancy themselves a pitching factory, and Edwin Arroyo is blocked. Seems like an easy trade offer for me.
A couple, though, I'm still going through therapy through last summer when I proposed, I think, what was it, Garrett Crochet to the Cincinnati Reds. My gosh, the Reds, firestorm back at me. But yeah, the reason why, why I was saying is generous. Chase Petty for Edwin Arroyo. If, obviously I think that might happen more if they keep Luis Robert Jr. until the trade deadline, although it sounds like they want to get him off the roster by Memorial Day for the fear of injury. But right now they do need a shortstop in their system, because Colson Montgomery, he literally got basically pulled off the road, got sent to Arizona, working on a swing. He just got back to AAA, Charlotte. Caleb Bonemer, he's at low A. So obviously, yes, you would like to have more swings at the wheel. So that's why I'm saying that if it's Chase Petty and Edwin Arroyo, I would drive Luis Robert Jr. to the airport myself. Well, that wraps up this edition of Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the all-new Locked On MLB Game Night. Every game, every night, all season long. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find MLB Game Night on Locked On MLB on YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcast. And I'll be back tomorrow with Noah Phelan of SouthsideShowdown.com to talk about if it's still worth it to dislike the Cubs more, or actually just dislike the AL Central Division rivals more. Feel free to leave comments about today's discussion regarding Rick Hahn finally breaking his silent, and the crossover segments discussing Luis Robert Jr.'s trade value with Locked On Mets and Locked On Reds. You can leave them at the episode page on YouTube, X formerly Twitter, at ToddJDub, or at Locked On Sox, or you can email me at LockedOnWhiteSox@gmail.com. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow.